Hello and welcome to our second of our 4 events here at the Granary Library for April is Poetry Month in Limerick. Tonight we're delighted to present, in association with Foras and Gaeilge, Remembering Michael Hartnett, a language seldom spoken. A timely lecture in Irish and English on the work of County Limerick poet Michael Hartnett, whose 20th anniversary occurs this year. Dr. John McDonaghwill and Dr. Stephen Newman of Mary Immaculate College will look at examples of his poetry in Irish following his farewell to English in 1975. They will also discuss his translations of poems by 17th century Limerick poet Dáibhí Ó Bruadair. Dr. John McDonaghwill will also explore Hartnett's Inchicore Haiku poems from 1985 and some poems charting his closest personal relationships. Dr. John McDonaghwill is a senior lecturer in the Department of English, Language and Literature at Mary Immaculate College, Limerick. He is the author of 5 books, including works on Brendan Kennelly, Michael Hartnett and Paul Durcan. Originally from Milford, County Cork, Stephen Newman works in the Department of Irish, Mary Immaculate College. Among his interests are modern literature in the Irish language, the Blasket autobiographies and the Irish manuscript tradition. Anyway, over to our gentlemen here, Dr. John McDonaghwill and Dr. Stephen Newman.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thanks so much for coming out tonight. The wine is good. Probably better than much I have to listen to. But myself and Stephen, it's nice for us to get back together because in 2008, I believe, 2006, oh my gosh, in 2006 we published this book with Four Courts Press on Michael Hartnett, and we got quite a stellar lineup of people to contribute. Seamus Heaney and Niall Hartnett both contributed, but Seamus Heaney wrote a wonderful introduction to it. And the book was published by Four Courts Press. It's one of the very few books out there giving any kind of a critical introduction to the work of Michael Hartnett. And we were just chatting about the editing process. It's funny how things have changed, that with Four Courts Press, we would send them off a typed chapter, and they would send back a typed chapter with handwritten editorial comments, nothing electronic. And I remember once after, I think it was in August sometime, I got a chapter back from Michael Adams, the late editor, and there was a ring of a wine glass on the bottom of it, and a bit of brie sticking 2 pages together. So I
Never. So decent cheddar, for God's sake.
So I knew what the guy was doing on his holidays.
Brie.
But those days are long gone. Those days are long gone because now it's all electronic. So myself and Steve are delighted. We want to keep it relatively informal tonight, so if you have any comments you'd like to make at any stage or jump in, please feel free. Stephen is an expert in Irish, so Stephen is going to it's going to be bilingual. I don't know, your Irish is probably excellent, mine isn't great, so when we were doing the book together I left the Irish to Stephen. I nearly left everything to Stephen, really, actually. But it's great to see you all here. We're going to start off with a kind of a brief biographical study of Michael. I'm then going to look at a farewell to English, and we're going to look at some specific poems. A few handouts, so you are getting something for nothing. Not only a very nice glass of wine, but you get a handout to take home with you and to read in bed tonight. So I will start off. That's obviously the cover of our book. It's still available. Is it? I'm not sure. Michael, as I'm sure you've heard from me, was born on September the 18th, 1941 in Croom, County Limerick. Lived for a period with his grandmother Bridget Halpin in Camas, but grew up mainly in Newcastle West. That would be the region he'd obviously be most well known for. And at 22 he moved to Dublin, where he became active on the literary scene, co-editing magazine Arena with James Liddy. And of course Arena was a very significant and important development in the emerging journal scene. And I read an article about 3 years ago looking at the importance of journals, small journals, and when the work that Dominic does with the Limerick Writers' Centre is so important, that the small publications tend to be at the cutting edge of new poets who are around, and they're very, very significant and very important. So I just want to thank Dominic for all the work he does. I think it's a tremendous contribution to contemporary poetry. And of course Arena was there. And he moved intermittently to London in 1961 and 1965 and married Rosemary Grantley on April the 4th, 1966. That's a very brief, partial biography of Michael Hartnett. There's plenty more to be filled in as we go along. Now we have a little clip here that we want to show you, give you a brief, again a nice little biographical introduction. Hopefully you can...
I was born in 1941 and I was a sickly child. Indeed, I still am. And apparently, when they saw me, there was no chance that I'd survive at all. But my mother fostered me out because times were tough in County Limerick. They sent me to my grandmother's house, and I was reared more or less by my granny, Mrs. Halpin, who was a native Irish speaker. She never spoke the language to her children, my mother and uncles and aunts, never. She spoke to her cronies who would come visiting at night, play cards and dance and all that. But my spot was up on the loft. So I was listening, of course, and I was just picking it up. I wasn't aware it was a different language. When I went back to Newcastle West to go to school, I didn't know the difference between the languages until I was told at school, when they taught me about on Tishel Ginneduk and then Tishel Tauruk and all these yokes that I could never figure out anyway, not even today. But I had, the word insight is a bit highfalutin, but I had that knowledge that the language was a viable, living language. I my vocal og, fado, daim she is ned. Bhí na gearcha clúfa fásta, is iad a scred. Derek sheed is tooling a ríist mocht. Sorm sa bhí muink clúif sa bhónéir fliuch. Níor gunna mé ach géig crín nó carn cloch. Ach untas crua ná bhra siad ag búla fui mocht. Den an lá húling céird a éilíonn ó mós, is dág a nigne, forba orb ná leisach fós. Cúsáile go dtí me cheann áthir, agus dúirt mé lé, Granny, the baby landed on my chest, and she said to me in English, aha, you're going to be a poet. Yes, an tám sé níos sé nó seacht, ní scríb mé focail, go dtí gaibh mé cuideag nó sin caideag. But bhí an ceatacha.
Is dóilm nach tagan an gléach tí an teangaháin ná is dóilm go dagan an gléach tí is dóilm go dag bhfuil an gléach féiginéthe difriúla, agus sin rud a bhfuil in na Michael dáiríre tá ilginéireacht an gléach atá ag mar defa, tá sé anna spéisiúil, Is file, deir a hiarafach, te se bhfuil ráte, bhfuil sé mé sír sa tradiisiúnas mar is file lán cho caiimsre leis an mosamó Michael chomá. So, is a géirig freagartá heil féin atá sé, mar atá go chéine goin.
Rugab me cheann bháthir i géirí ó thuaigh timpeall 1870 nó mar sin. Ben an Gaeilge bei agus bhí 19th century woman, she never came to terms with the 20th century. Rudimer, telefiche, radio, electricity, beyond her ken entirely. The Gaeilge millinege shaska huid no shaska shenish, anoka tree in Lissagum. Ach the squeeze dawn, couple no 3 dawn, iri. The shall count the squeeze asperle. Is until it's right now, death of an Irish woman.
So Michael Jolene, you heard him there. Again, he draws a lot from his grandmother's folk mind, I suppose, and we believe when she told him he was destined to be a poet. And of course, we'll talk about her later, that his sort of connection with the Gaelic world was through his grandmother, who he saw as a remnant of that world, maintaining a sort of a mindset that had long been maybe outdated in modern Ireland, but she was sort of a link. But I'll be coming back to her in a while. John, if you want to go for it. Or will we read the poem about her?
Yes.
Through her?
Yeah.
Which is in the collection Farewell to English, Death of an Irish Woman. And I'll just read that. And ignorant, in the sense she ate monotonous food and thought the world was flat, and pagan in the sense she knew the things that moved at night were neither dogs nor cats but pukas and dark-faced men. She nevertheless had fierce pride, but sentenced in the end to eat thin, diminishing porridge in a stone-cold kitchen. She clenched her brittle hands around the world she could not understand. I loved her from the day she died. She was a summer dance at the crossroads. She was a card game where a nose was broken. She was a song that nobody sings. She was a house ransacked by soldiers. She was a language seldom spoken. She was a child's purse full of useful things. And he basically emphasises her connection with a world lost. And he reminds me of Martin O'Kine and Scrivener Martin O'Kine, Scrivener Prose Gaeilge. I'll read out what he said in a famous lecture in 1969 talking about his background, and I'll translate it then. Ba as sail and veilidish, sail nach rev moran aharuer le mila and blian nuas a fashkach me. As an ginal shall sail an tiana scale, an tiana auron, an tiana ganash, na pishroiga mas alat, a moon liach na keirta gloom gael. I emerged from the world of folklore, from a world that hadn't changed for over 1,000 years. The world of the old stories, the old song, the old custom, the pishog or superstition that formed hundreds of generations of Irish. And Hartnett places his grandmother within that. Now O'Kine could easily, from the Gaeltacht of Cushfarga, say he was inextricably linked to that tradition, but Hartnett felt that his grandmother in what was a Gaeltacht, an ex-Gaeltacht of West Limerick, is also formed by that worldview, outlook, whatever, and that's what he kind of talks about in Death of an Irish Woman. I'll just go back to you, John, about Farewell to English here.
Well, there was a good little segue there. That, I didn't grow up in Limerick, as you can probably tell from my accent. I grew up in Dublin. So my exposure to Michael Hartnett was very limited. But the first poem I remember coming across by Michael Hartnett was one a priest who taught me, who beat English into me, literally and metaphorically, was A Farewell to English. And I have just a few sections from A Farewell to English, from the actual poem itself that I want to read to you and give you on a handout. But just to give you a little bit of a background, it's, you know, when you look at a poet's life, you can look at very key moments and key events. I think The Farewell to English was a key moment. It brought Hartnett very much into a much broader public consciousness outside of his locality in Limerick. And his decision to move from one language to another was enormous. When you think of Samuel Beckett moving from English to French, and the difficulty for a poet particularly to change language in midstream is an extraordinary decision. And it caused him a bit of difficulty at the time. I remember Brendan Kennelly, who I wrote a book about many years ago, and thought he was crazy. He thought he was crazy in a lot of ways. But he thought he was particularly crazy to turn his back on English. Now, he came back to English eventually, but I think this decision to return to the Irish language was hugely important for him. And he wrote about it. He said, the attitude of the government at the time that was part of the reason why he decided to change. A coalition containing Conor Cruise O'Brien et al. I don't think Conor Cruise O'Brien was top of his Christmas card list. I don't think they would have shared the same political philosophy. Irish was an embarrassing language to have. You couldn't trade with it in Brussels. I wanted to make a stand for what it was worth. So it's an interesting political decision that he was regarding the Irish language. And what I like about Michael Hartnett's work is it's very contemporary to its time. He's very political. He charted the beginning of the Celtic Tiger. There's a poem I want to look at a little bit later on, where he talks about, he describes Dublin as a glass and concrete anus. And he describes this at the end of the 1990s into the turn of the new millennium. And it's a very stark example, I think, of the change in Dublin around that time with the Celtic Tiger, the blooms. And how does Hartnett describe it? As a beautiful description. Whenever I drive up to Dublin, I see these fancy new buildings, I can't get that image of the glass and concrete anus out of my head, which is not pleasant a lot of the time. So his decision to move from one language to another is very significant for me, because he describes in A Farewell to English the conflict in his soul between one language and another. And I use the poem a lot when I'm doing literary theory with first year students, and we discuss the notion of what is the role and the connection between your language and your identity, and the extent to which you are what you say. And we all think, we all feel, we're emotive creatures, but the extent that your personality is defined by your language is so important, that throughout your life you will fall in love because of language. You will have an economic existence because of language. You will have an identity because of language. And to decide to change that is hugely important. And one of the I think the echoes I get in Hartnett's decision is obviously that famous scene from Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man by James Joyce, when Stephen Dedalus is talking to the Dean of Studies, ironically in the same school that I went to. We went to the same school, and this happened to me as well. I should have written a book about it, really. I could be famous. But he has this famous this famous section where he has this discussion with the Dean of Studies, and the word tundish is mentioned. And Stephen doesn't know what a tundish is, and he goes, what's this word? And of course, this being Stephen Dedalus, being James Joyce, he starts to fret. And he starts to worry. He says, oh my God, he said, this English language, his language, so familiar and so foreign, will always be for me an acquired speech. I have not made or accepted its words. My voice holds him at bay. My soul frets in the shadow of his language. Now, that for me is precisely what Michael Hartnett is writing about in The Farewell to English, is the notion of his soul fretting against the power of English, because English is not his language. And English is a language he has chosen to write in and to publish in up to this moment, but he says his soul is Irish and in the Irish language. And this is why he decides to change. So I think there's a very strong kind of Joycean, I think, hangover. So I have a handout for everybody, folks. I'll explain to you about the poem on the front is what I'm going to come back to. It's not by Michael Hartnett at all, it's by Paul Durcan. But I'll come back to that one in a second. When I photocopied these today, I was chatting to Steve and said, will I do 10? 20 or 30, and then said, well, I do 100, and he just laughed at me. So I'm not too bad. Nearly got there. I'm going to come back first to that poem, The Poet and the Judge by Paul Durcan, because Michael Hartnett features in it. Because as you know, Paul Durcan and Michael Hartnett were very good friends over the years. But I have, if you turn over the page, and you see, I'll come back to that actor kiss. There's a few haikus, but I have 3 sections from A Farewell to English. Now, A Farewell to English is a long poem. I have it over here. So this is A Farewell to English by Gallery Press. And the poem itself is a long poem. It's in 7 different sections. So I've taken 3 sections. I've taken the first section, which I think, Steve, would you read the first section? Because you'll get the Gaeilge right. And then I'll read the next 2 sections.
Her eyes were kinds of porter, and her West Limerick voice talked velvet in the house. Her hair was black as the glossy fireplace, wearing with grace her Sunday night dance best. She cut the frost from the glasses with a knife and hammered golden whiskies on the bar, and her mountainy body tripped the gentle mechanism of verse. The minute interlock of word and word began, the rhythm formed. I sunk my hands into tradition for sifting the centuries for words. This quiet excitement was not new. Emotion challenged me to make it sayable. The cliché came at first, like matchsticks snapping from the world of work. Máinle, shave, dúbhailteach, áling, queen. They came like great slabs of slate breaking from an ancient quarry. Máinle, shave, dúbhailteach, áling, queen. Slowly vaulting down the dark unused escarpments. Máinle, shave, dúbhailteach, áling, queen. A sort of vocabulary you find in the Ashling poetry of 18th century Ireland, and the spare van or sky woman was always described in those terms, and he's drawing from poets of the region like Owen Rua O'Sullivan and Egon O'Rahilla, who I'll mention in a while. Do you want a bit, or that section? Crashing on the cogs, splinters like axe heads damaging the wheels, clogging the intricate machine. Máinle, shave, dúbhailteach, áling, queen. Then Pegasus pulled up, the girth broke, and I was flung back on the gravel of Anglo-Saxon. What was I doing with these foreign words? I, the polisher of the complex clause, wizard of grasses and warlock of birds, midnight oiled in the metric laws.
I think you hopefully get from that Michael Hartnett really lends himself to a close reading. His control of English, I think, is extraordinary. His control of rhythm and the very natural metre of his poetry, for me, I think is exceptional. And this is why, Farewell to English seems like the greatest tragedy of all. And this is the section that's probably the most quoted section of Farewell to English, where he talks about Chef Yates, that master of the use of herbs, could raise mere stew to a glorious height. pinch of saga, stew some on philosophy, carefully stirred in to get the flavour right, and cook a poem around the basic verbs. Our commie chefs attend and learn the trade, bemoan the scraps of Gaelic that they know, add to a simple Anglo-Irish stock, Cuchullin's marrow bones to marinate, a dash of O'Rahilla simmered slow, a glass of University Hick Hock, sniff and stand back and proudly offer you the celebrated Anglo-Irish stew. And I remember chatting to Paul Durcan a number of years ago, and he said that Michael Hartnett was an excellent chef. Apparently he was a very good cook, and he had the Larousse guide to cooking, if there is such a thing. He had this book beside him, and he was very much into cooking. Now, he doesn't look like a man who ate very much.
No.
And of course, one of the other constant references in his poetry is to drinking, honestly. There's always glasses or barmaids and pints and frothy heads and glasses of whiskey being slapped on counters. And even again here, a glass of University Hick-Haycock. I think he had the usual poet's disdain for academics as well. And I think poets are right to be disdainful, to be honest with you. And the very final section here is you see here, this is, well, it's not the very final section of the poem, sorry, there's 7 sections, but this is where he actually discusses why he's saying goodbye to English. I say farewell to English verse, to those I found in English nets, my Lorca holding out his arms to love the beauty of his bullets, Pasternak who outlived Stalin and died because of lesser beasts. To all the poets I've loved, from Wyatt to Robert Browning, to Father Hopkins in his crowded grave, and to our bugbear Mr. Yeats, who forced us into exile on islands of bad verse. Among my living friends there is no poet I do not love, although some write with bitterness in their hearts. They are one art, are many arts. Poets with progress make no peace of pact. The act of poetry is a rebel act. And I think that last line, this notion of poetry as a rebel act, is a very significant contribution to poetry around the time Michael Hartnett wrote it. Brendan Kennelly wrote the Book of Judas and the Book of Cromwell, or Cromwell and the Book of Judas. And in it he said that a poet really is there to betray the age. That the function of poetry is to challenge stereotypes, is to challenge the self, is to challenge your self-perception. That poetry, I'm not being prescriptive, but poetry can do a lot of things. Poetry can do whatever poetry likes, because poetry is quite a broad church. But one of its functions is to be a rebel act, is to stand against the tide. And what Michael was describing here was clearly this idea that Irish was a language that was being paid lip service to by the government and by the state. And I felt strongly this when I was brought up in Dublin. It might have been different in different parts of the country, but we didn't like Irish. Well, I didn't like it in school. I didn't like the way it was taught. The teachers didn't seem to enjoy teaching it. It seemed to me as if it was something that was being forced upon us by outside powers who kind of linked our national identity with the language and couldn't extricate the two. But that's just me. It's not everyone else's experience.
Therapy.
Sorry, Steve. Yeah, this is therapy. So if you want to charge me €100 for that, send me the bill.
So, actually, let me quit das Gaeilge, but in Orclin the Pecoige, in the Peacock Theatre, in Mian Vehev, Nedeg Shachto Cahar, June 1974, Dógar Hartnett, sort of Gopwibili, den Cheadúr, his official sort of a public announcement, Gemach Shake Fogal Slán Le Berle. Agus vi Martin O'Dearán, a highly prominent Irish language poet, Martin O'Dearán, was present on the night in the Peacock Theatre, Dublin, June 1974. That was recorded as a sort of a moment. And as part of this return to Irish was going to be an experiment in living also, in a sense. Bhí sé chun bailile clia a ágant agus dul go dtí Temple and Glantown, Neil and Picture Rova. But Temple Glantown, outside Newcastle West, is on the peripheries of this region known as Sliabh Luachra. Okay, not a defined area in terms of maps. Brendan O'Buchala, the scholar, came up with this map in his edition of Egan O'Rahilla's poetry. It's sort of a place of the mind, if you want, that stretches from Killarney up to North Kerry, West Limerick, out to Shroud and Willen, Mill Street in County Cork. This general region, not defined by a border, but it's to this landscape, about 10 kilometres from his own town in Newcastle West, he would decide to settle in. Okay. Now, it was a non-Irish speaking area, so it's strange. If you just go back to the Newell Nichols, you know, Michael belongs to the uplands beyond Newcastle, to Temple Glanton out west and up the Barna Gap. This belongs, and she recognised this in her essay on Hartnett, to the general area of Slieve Luachra, which is still a strong area in terms of music, dance and so on. It has its own musical styles, and Slieve Luachra set and dance and so on, but linguistically has shifted to English, but had a strong Irish-speaking community in living memory, a fact which is still important in the local culture, and that's still true today to a large extent. The view from the Barna Gap out of the rich farmlands of East Limerick is quite spectacular. The uplands are very different. Michael himself made much of this distinction, making out there were two very different tribes to this very day. He insisted that he had belonged to the early prehistoric peoples of Ireland, the Fomorians, or the Tuatha De Danann, his surname who Hartnett, meaning people of the stone axe. Now, there is a sense of mythologizing in a sense. We mentioned his grandmother earlier. Now, how Gaelic she was or how much Irish she knew, where he learned from, is open to question. If you look at the census from that period, say she does appear in the 1901 census, 1911 census. Now, most of them from that region, the older people, 70 and 80, will have marked Irish English in the box for language. Most of the younger people, and she was only a young girl in those census, often English is just written. Now, where she is, actually, they don't fill in the language section at all. Now, you'd imagine at this period, when she was a child, she would have had her grandparents' generation as fluent native speakers, so she would have had it. But to what extent, he may have exaggerated. My colleague Roisin Garvey from the area, who studied it and has argued that he probably picked up quite a lot from her. This idea that the older people were speaking Irish in the house at night and he was listening to them, as he mentioned in the film, and is part of a mythologizing better and a sense of legitimizing his return to Irish. So there's a part of that. And in these statements where he connects himself to sort of ancient tribes and all, is part of this. And to move to Temple Glanton is to connect to something spiritual more than linguistic. Now, why, if you're going to turn to Irish, not move to an Irish-speaking area on Gaeilge and so on? So here's where he moved to in 1975. I'll translate this.
Okay, bro, Gaeilge pont de gessen duschen. Fiar Haiku doidir isant, dun an tapsha I canna. Agus de brí búil sé goáil den scrínoireach go lán einsreach, beag deachrachtaí nach beagige, slí bethe bhaint amach dó féin. Go háidethe os rud é gur an maidin a bheith sé ag scríb festa. Tuige mar sin gur thug sé cúil leis an bríomhcard le na hachtan se le bheith ag cuma sa líochta in Gaeilge.
Is film is ach níl os béle an wat goede ribbe ná a riel a sies go clean becht déin you can't fall. You mean on sin nish ribbe ná of down na hen.
Nis ken far ashrig tú ó bheith ag scríb mer le gotí scrínoireacht go Gaeilge.
Well, níl a rí scíris go geart. Bhíodh mé ag léamh na mórí lí as Gaeilge gach lá agus bíam léamh níos ó Bruadair ó rathair agus daoine mar sin. Na léamh agus a siar léamh íomháin hí a sios, peann agus páir agus. Bhí mé chun dáin sin plí léirciúil na cheap na féin a scríomh agus de tháinig go ráméis meastar amach. Because with a macaronic song, as I was walking one evening fair as make a day and I came out like, no, I would machine it amach. He kind of go with me there. Or a salary. It's boxed up, Michelle. Yeah, go,
So the news report opens, announcing his arrival, and they describe how difficult it's going to be for him to make a living here. He doesn't have a job there, doesn't really have a farm apart from the pig, and he's going to write in Irish. So the reporter is being a bit concerned about how this experiment is going to work out. So sitting there interviewing him, then you can see sort of expression of why. Cén fá Gwyl Twig, and he says, I don't know. He says, as you can hear, I'm not a fantastic speaker of Irish, so anyone familiar with the language will know that he's slightly hesitant there. He doesn't speak with a huge amount of fluency. He's not that practiced. He's very standardised. It's not possible to... He's a Munster dialect, but it's not like someone who spent a lot of time in the Gaeilge and is imitating them. There seems to be a bit of lack of confidence. He says then, again, this idea that it started flowing, which he expresses in the Farewell to English, that I just sat down one night to write a small, simple lyric, and it began to flow, and it began as macaronic, English-Irish, crisscrossing, till this thing emerged. And he just says in the last line there, well, I'm half Tomé la Gaul, and Gaul being the word in Irish for the foreigner, the English speaker, and la Gael, I'm half Irish, I'm half, and I just trying to deal with this in some way. So he goes on, again he feels like he has to justify himself in that interview. Again, the interviewer makes him justify himself in a way, and a lot of people at the time did sort of maybe put that pressure on him to produce.
There's the little section from also from Florentian. I saw our governments the other night, I think the scene was Leopardstown, galloping towards the prize, a glass and concrete anus. And you know the infamous Galway Tent that Fianna Fáil had in the 90s, which seems to epitomise all that was about to go wrong in the Irish economy. I think this notion of mentioning Leopardstown as well seems to buy into this concept. But I just want to show one very brief haiku in terms of what Stephen is talking about. This is one here. Sorry, it took me a while to find it. In terms of his relationship with Irish. And I'll come back to look at the haiku quite soon. My English dam bursts, and out stroll all my bastards. Irish shakes its head. And I think this is a beautiful little haiku to kind of summarise exactly what he's talking about. That his English dam bursts, and he regards the language as a bastard language. And I love this idea of Irish shaking its head. Because I get the kind of impression through the 19th century and the 20th century, this is what Irish had to do in this country when the juggernaut that is the English language came along and swept everything in its path, as it appears to be doing to a lot of other cultures around the world. I think there are a lot of languages shaking their heads in the onslaught of English. Steve said that.
Yeah, and again, it's interesting you use that idea he does in the interview of something just flowing out, that is somehow he's not in control of his linguistic choice in one way. In another way he might say it's a sort of a political statement and so on, but he constantly repeated the idea. And again, going back to English again, well, sort of it just happened by English dam. We'll go back to Temple Glantine and his first collection that emerged from here, so it would take almost 3 years. Now this is a report from the Irish Independent in September 1975, I think. His first step after a farewell to English, I won't be able to read that now, but
no, that's okay.
Was that not current slide, isn't it? Was Cúlú Ida, or the retreat of Ida Cagney, and there was a special launch in Listowel. They had a special weekend, it wasn't the Writers' Week, in September, when he got to launch his first step, which was a bilingual version, and present were Paul Durcan, Desmond Egan and Mr. Hartnett, who will be reading their own poetry, and there will also be musical items, whatever that is. Okay. So this was his first publication, The Retreat of Ida Cagney, which then appeared later in Arca Brick, and it's been republished a few times. He says it's not a translation, it's two versions of the same poem. After that, he would sort of settle into writing only in Irish in Temple Glantine. And in 1978, so bhí 1978 fáilsíoch Arca Brick, Céad Canúsach Gaeilge, his first Irish language collection. Agus, ní hégur cuireadh an fáilte ribh an Ganúsach seo, wasn't overly welcomed, mar bhí galore ceistena, many questions, mar gheall chaidán a chuig Gaeilge, the standard of his Irish. What would strike some people, now I have enough copies of the thing, I don't know where, going around. One thing some people will notice is And one thing he said at the time was, I'd like to take up where the Dán Díreach, or the sort of classical Irish poem, ended. Éinneamh ilta nua iliocht na heimsere sin. Anyone familiar with modern Irish language poetry of the time noticed that dialect was strongly in evidence. All the poets, even the Cork City poets, the Inti poets, Michael Davitt, Liam Muirhalla, who weren't born in the Gaeltacht, they learnt Irish there, and the dialect comes through very strongly. Marlavachati from Dublin, but closely associated with the Kerry Gaeltacht. You can see it. Sean O'Riordan, his dialect is to the fore. Martin O'Dearon, you know he's from Connemara. Later, Cathal O'Sharkig in the 70s, 80s, you know he's from Ulster. There's something sort of neutral about Michael Hartnett, even classical. Again, like he spoke, the language has a certain standardised quality. It doesn't seem to belong to the Gaeltachts that were still alive. This is probably deliberate in a sense. And the poem I put around, there isn't enough of them there. A lot of the poetry from this appears later in translation, just for your information, those of you who doesn't know it. In 87, A Necklace of Rains was published, and this has poems in Irish and English. Most of the collection, Arca Brick, not all of it, reappears here with the original Irish and the English. So he eventually would make this collection accessible to a wider audience. One of the poems, which again stated he's worked on this link with the past. He mentioned in the interview as well that I was reading Ó Bruadair or Rahalla. So he had certainly an obsession with the Munster Gaelic poets, the main ones, Ó Rahalla, Ó Bruadair, who we'll talk about later, and Ó Súilbháin. And this is called Fís Deireanach ón Rua I Thuilleabháin. It's a short poem. I'll read it in both languages and just give a brief discussion on it. The hall bón imagine, Kyo Banya gach glaun, is hánig glóir cos a nául, ó chlasa bána na meaun, chunig mé mar scáilena, ma spalpíní fánacha, is in onad sláán nó ránacha hí rose gúil an choch. Now again, my colleague Roisin Garvey has discussed this poem. I'm going to steal some of her analysis, as she came first with it. The last vision of Owen Rua Ó Súilbháin, and I'll just read the English first. The cow of morning spurted, milk mist on each glen, and the noise of feet came from the hill's white sides. I saw like phantoms my fellow workers, and instead of spades and shovels, they had roses on their shoulders. Now, it very much, in the Irish version, draws from the language again of the 18th century poets. He's skipped the modern contemporary Gaeltacht, and he's drawing imagery from the likes of Owen Rua Ó Súilbháin, who was well known in this area and was a spalpín fánach. These were the sort of farm labourers who travelled around seeking work. The cow of morning spurted milk mist on each glen, Kyo Banya. Again, Owen has a poem, Kyo Driachta, the magic mist. And this one, actually, it's a sort of a political poem in a way, which Owen Rua and most of these poets were highly political. They were Jacobites and nationalists in that tradition, believing in the return of the Stuart king and so on. But here, he sort of updates Owen Rua Ó Súilbháin for a modern audience, and because a lot of the ideas in these poetry was liberation of Ireland, liberation of the Irish people, of the language, return of the right king. He brings a sort of, as he imagines Owen Rua, who had visions of a freed Ireland, a sort of liberated people, Hartnett sees phantoms, my fellow workers. Now, Roisin believes this is sort of a commentary in modern times, and those working class people who he identified with in the towns of, like Newcastle West and cities like Dublin, even in the countryside. And instead of spades and shovels, they had roses. Now, the rose was a key symbol in the Aisling poems, in the 18th century ones associated with the Stuart kings, and a sort of a symbol of liberation. So it's at once a poem that echoes and draws from the 18th century poet Owen Rua, but manages to bring a contemporary sort of political outlook to it. And this, Roisin, in her analysis, which you can read in our book, and she has also written an essay in Filiocht Co Limerick and the Gaeilge, that his poetry in Irish was about renewal, renewing tradition, but not just sort of being sentimental or just writing about these poets, withdrawing from them to say something that was new, that there was some sort of message in them. Now, will I say more about the collection? Sure. Yeah, there's more. If you go through the next page, Arca Brick is full of simple nature lyrics. I'd like to, before I didn't take much notice of them, it's easy, passed them by. Okay, here's the grandmother's cottage, we've seen all that, and we know where we are, we're in that Schlieve Look. I can't get the, here's a clicker thing. That,
oh yeah, the clicker is
the mouse is gone. Yeah. Go on there a bit. I'll just go from beginning and go on. That's what to do. I don't know. Click on there anyway. We'll see what. You can see a poem. Yeah, there's over Arca Brick. Okay, we'll stop here at Brown Glace. This is a green land. And as someone who's probably learning to write in Irish, he becomes a poet in Irish while still being a learner. Fála mór Gaeilge shahe, fadas atá sé ag iarraidh go bheith ina fila Gaeilge. Agus scríofann sé, dúirt sé sa rudaí go raibh go mbeadh sé ag iarraidh lyricí shimply a scríobh. Simple lyrics. And we saw the location of the house. A lot of the collection has quite an interesting nature section, which is very sparse and is based on observations of the landscape around him. We have the hare and I have the wounded otter. Just read the hare on Gira. Again, I'll do both versions and try and watch the time. Brown Glace, hí smuinte glasa glúba go ciún I bord go hagana. Bulla bo, bulla banya, furbert rave village fe halav. Chula she turnach, hit an spare a drim, dalp an slíomh an ghrian sheer, muchach an dawan mar hippín solish lá guiha, viog a hall is stig fe chlúv bio a builig, vi a súlia oscailt, scrav an vosh ag lut, an glunder, ag lut na linrach. Madome a chalín, ni a vein scian agam, chun the clown a haval, madome. He's very much in tune with his natural environment, and he was known as a great lover of nature and could name plants and birds in both languages exquisitely. Again, saying his grandmother taught him all he knew in terms of naming nature. The hare, it was a green world. So this Temple Glantine world of Michael Hartnett, of the sort of lone figure Hartnett, the poet in the landscape. And there's a nice picture of him here, actually observing nature and the bridge in Newcastle West. It was a green world, green thoughts curled quietly in her mind's field. Cow smell, milk smell, sweet root expansion underground. She heard thunder, the sky fell on her back, the hill gulped down the sun, the world was quenched like a match in wind. Under her belly's fur, the live litter kicked. Her eyes were open, death's scum destroying the joy, the great shining. Forgive me, girl. I had no knife to cut your children free. Forgive me. So he's very much emotionally attached to this hare and how he could not intervene in saving the children. They're very short lines, descriptive in a sense. And it's only recently, the first time I was dealing with Hartnett, I didn't kind of make the connections. I started thinking about his fascination with the early Irish lyrics, and which he had been working on long before this, in the late 60s, the Hag of Bear, and the monastic poems. And actually, I never thought about it actually till only last week, and I could be totally wrong, because a guy that likes the bar and the pub and the socialising, you don't think of as a monk, someone who's monastic. But in many ways, he did sort of crave or had a certain inclination towards the monastic. And he had a particular interest in the early Irish monastic poems. And a key book, some of you might be familiar with it, in his Irish language poetry is Gerard Murphy's Early Irish Lyrics, published first in 1956. And the first time the old Irish originals, from later manuscripts, some of them, and his translations were published. Now what Hartnett did, he took this text and he would have, Murphy's translations are sort of literal, and he would have adapted them. They appear in, now just listen to some of his monastic poems. Now these were Marylvan, the hermit speaks. He translated a lot of verses from Marylvan, who was a brother of the king of Connacht, 7th century, who forsook the life of a warrior prince and became a hermit. Now, Hartnett was also someone who forsook something. He left English in the cosmopolitan Dublin and the English literary scene and university scene. His brother tried to persuade him to return to the courts, and this was his answer. And this is Hartnett translating him. And again, they're like his nature poems in Irica Brick, I think, in their simplicity, their sparseness, and the observations, the way they observe nature. For I inhabit a wood. This is from the 9th century Old Irish. For I inhabit a wood, unknown but to my God, my house of hazel and ash. It's in the handout somewhere, as an old hut in a rat. The stags erupt from rivers, brown mountains tell the distance. I am glad as poor as this, even in men's absence. All at evening, the day's first meal since dawn's bread, trapped trout, sweet sloes and honey haws, beer and herbs. So that monastic life where nature is just around him. It's small, tame bands, the badgers are grey outside and foxes dance before my door all the night. Again, if the wounded otter, and I won't read that out there again, is another one where he's observing nature in a way that these the monks, while they used to be copying the Gospels and so on in Latin into the manuscripts, the lyrics appeared on the margins. A lot of them came to us. So when they were distracted from their actual work, they were looking out windows and writing lyrics, and that's when Irish first began to be written. It was through these early Irish lyrics. And Hartnett even says about these lyrics, and it's sort of, I'll let John back in there now. I'm kind of finishing up there for a minute. I was always believed in the economy of means. This had to do with my reading of early Irish poetry, which was syllabic and demanded perhaps too dreadful a discipline. The original Tao, and I don't know if John's going to mention it in a while, was what fascinated me by its conciseness and its connection with Irish nature poems. No verbiage. And Irica Brick is a collection of poetry that isn't verbose or showy or in any that way, which a lot of Irish language poetry often can be showy because great poets were displaying their skills. I'll just leave him, Irica Brick, for a moment. I'll return to the personal poems later, maybe. We have time.
Well, you're having your handout, folks, here at the poem that I just want to make a quick reference to by Paul Durcan. I know we're jumping ship a little here, but Paul Durcan did get a mention that he was present in the theatre the night Michael Hartnett made his...
And he was in the stall at the first launch of the retreat of Ivor Cagney. He was
That's right.
present at a lot of his...
That's correct. Now, you probably would have guessed, if you know Paul Durcan, that the very title, The Poet and the Judge, would straight away tell you that this is Paul Durcan, because his father was infamously, I should say, a judge in the west of Ireland, John Durcan, for a number of years. And this is a poem Paul Durcan published about 10 or 15 years ago, about a night with Michael Hartnett. My father, I'd like to read it in Durcan's manner. Well, I won't. Because,
Declaim.
My father was known as the Judge, for the not unjust reason that he worked as a judge of the Assize, the judge on the Western Circuit of Ireland, the counties of Mayo and Galway. Silence in court, the judge is coming in, cried the crier John Frayne from under the reporters' gallery. On a winter's night in Dublin, after spending 4 or 5 hours in Dwyer's public house in Lower Leeson Street quaffing pints of Phoenix, I suggested to the poet Mike Hartnett that we purchase half a dozen bottles of Phoenix and repair to my parents' home in 57 Dartmouth Square, up the street and over the canal bridge, and listen to my LPs of Buddy and Elvis and Fats and Lightnin and Sonny and John Lee and Little Richard and Ray Charles and Jerry Lee Lewis, the Rocket. My parents would be long gone to bed at the top of the Victorian 3-storey red brick terraced house. Sitting nicely in the downstairs basement breakfast room, Mike took a mahogany dining chair and, laying it on its back, lay down on the carpet, put his feet up, and, lighting up a fag, a woodbine, gave me a drag. To make ourselves comfortable was the thing. 5 years later, we'd have been rolling joints. I sat in an armchair, pleased that the poet, my prodigious friend, had made himself so immediately at home. Hours seemed to pass, such was our mystical contentment, puffing smoke rings, imbibing, listening, so that when the door opened as if of its own accord, this seemed a natural happening, as well as synchronicity, until in the doorway we saw the 100% embodiment of my father, the judge, in navy blue dressing gown with red cord, yellow tassels. He peered down at Mike, and Mike peered back up at the judge, blowing him, it seemed, an extra smoke ring as a signal of mutual esteem and recognition. "Mr. Hartnett," my father declaimed, "do you not think you should be at home in your own bed?" "If you say so, Judge, if you say so." "I do say so, Mr. Hartnett, I do say so." Mike, charming to the last cannonball exploding on the field of a lost battle in Austria, cried out, "Ihawa avreha buasal. Good night to thee, O noble judge." First we tittered, a pair of truant, precocious schoolgirls. Then we split our sides laughing, until we subsided in shocked silence. "Christ," muttered Mike, "I'd better make tracks." I let him out the side door into the spear-carrying night of Dartmouth Square, palinged and padlocked. 30 years later, while I myself was moaning and groaning and pining away, alone in a cave in the Docklands, Mike was to make his home with kind Angela Liston in the Dartmouth Square of the judge, the padlocks and the high black palings. I think that's just a lovely personal note between Durcan and Hartnett. There's another poem actually that Paul Durcan has in Life is a Dream, where, and this comes to I think a very interesting story. One of the jobs that Michael Hartnett had when he went to Dublin was he was a telephonist. He worked in the old days when phones rang. You would you'd have to plug them in. You see them on old films. I have to explain to my daughter what this is all about. She just looks at me and thinks, "What are you on about?" But plugging in phones, and this was Michael's job. And I can remember I was down at the Kennelly Festival one year, and I met the late Desmond Fitzgerald at the night of Glynn. One of the most well-spoken gentlemen I've ever met in my life, the most beautiful accent. And Michael met him when he visited the Joyce Tower in Sandycove, where Michael Hartnett had a job as a curator. And apparently himself and Durcan talk about smoking joints. This is what Paul Durcan told me. That their favourite spot was to go up on a sunny Sunday evening on the top of the Martello Tower and roll a few and just sit there looking at the clouds going by. A very dangerous place to do it. It's not a great idea. But when Michael was introduced to Desmond Fitzgerald, he famously, Desmond Fitzgerald walked up to him and said, "Desmond Fitzgerald, Knight of Glynn." And Michael Hartnett, "Night telephonist."
Touché.
That's a very famous kind of quote from Michael Hartnett, which really, I think, kind of sums up the kind of ordinary humanity of the man as well.
Exactly.
So, would we finish up on a couple of haiku? Would you be happy with that? Just a few, because you have them on your hand. Are you happy with that, Steve?
We'll do a haiku, and we'll do one O Bruadair one, will we?
Fantastic. I'll have a quick look at the haikus, folks. For the siblings, you have a few haikus in front of you, and I think his haikus. I actually have a copy of Inchicore Haiku. It's a very rare book. This one. Find it. Yeah, this is Inchicore Haiku. And Inchicore Haiku was first published by Raven Arts Press in Dublin. And one of the attractions for Hartnett in terms of haiku was the fact that by that stage he was drinking quite heavily, and he was finding poetic inspiration hard to come by, because he was struggling with form. The easy rhythmical form of his early poetry was beginning to desert him. And what haiku does is, haiku imposes a strict form upon you. You've no choice but to write 17 syllables. You've no choice but to write 3 lines. You have to stick to the form. So the form inadvertently gives a kind of a structure and a logic to a mind, to a poetic mind that is struggling. Dylan Thomas once famously wrote, "Do not go gently into that good night," a very famous villanelle about the death of his father. And he said he was so angry and so drunk when he wrote the poem that the form of the villanelle gave structure to his anger, like a boxer. You know, boxers don't just fling punches, they carefully control their anger. And this is what form can sometimes give to a poet, is a kind of a logic and a kind of form. And the Inchicore Haiku, written in 1985, I think they're incredibly powerful and very relevant in terms of their critique of the church, in terms of their critique of the social order in Ireland, the inequality that he experienced when he was living in Dublin, living in very straitened circumstances when he moved to Dublin in the 80s, very, very difficult times. It's nice, I did show you the slide there where there is a plaque to Michael Hartnett, which is nice, in Inchicore to mark his time. But you'll see here, there's a few of the haiku we'll just have a quick look at. I printed them off for you. And as you know, a haiku is a very simple Japanese form of 17 syllables. And if you ever want to write poetry, have a go, have a try. My favourite haiku is this one. To write a poem with 17 syllables is very difficult.
Oh, gee. Brave attempt.
But here are a few of Michael Hartnett's far better haiku. My father, now lost, gave me the mind of a Christ. I drink with Pilate. From St. Michael's Church, the Electric Angelus, another job gone. I remember reading that to Father McWall, who's the chaplain in Mary Immaculate. He got a good laugh out of that because that seems to be the case now. Campanology and bell ringing seems to have gone out of fashion. No, you don't hear bells really rung anymore. It's an Electric Angelus. And the first one as well, a great description I once heard by a Japanese poet called Basho. He said that a haiku is like looking out a window at a scene and a raindrop falls right in front of your eye and it passes down in front of your eye just for a split second. You catch it as it comes down, and then when it is right in front of your eye, it magnifies for a second and distorts a little because it's not a perfect shape. It distorts and bends, but it magnifies intensely for a second and then it's gone. And that is what a haiku really should be. A haiku is this very short, pithy vignette of life. And I think Hartnett imbues his, I think, with quite a strong personal tone. I am not afraid. I will die proud like I lived, only petrified. In St. Michael's Church, a plush bishop in his frock confirms poverty. And I love this one. What do bishops take when the price of bread goes up? A vow of silence. Clouds collide above. Stars gossip incessantly. Noise will drive me mad. And then again, another haiku related to the social situation he found himself living in Inchicore. In local chippers, sad cod dream in fresh batter. The Atlantic cries. I think it's beautiful. And then, one of the last haikus in the collection. Dying in exile. To die without a people is the real death. And I think those haiku, that collection of haiku, and I like and read quite a lot of haiku. I still think that Hartnett's 1985 collection is the finest collection of haiku I've ever read. Because he blends the poetic, the natural images, which most haikus tend to deal with birds and nature, etc., which is a constant theme running throughout all of Hartnett's work, is the appreciation of nature and the importance of nature. And he tends to, when he goes to Dublin, the city tends to become this harsh place, that the pastoral images, so popular in his early poetry, tend to disappear, and the city does not appear as a welcoming place in a lot of Hartnett's later poetry. It's a harsh place. Despite the fact that there's more people there, there's less of a community. And he's surrounded by bricks and mortar and that concrete vainness that I referred to earlier on. This is how he describes the city. The city is not... And I think it's interesting with Paul Durcan, this also is reflected in Durcan's work. When he writes about Mayo and going home to Mayo, Mayo is this pastoral, beautiful place, whereas the city is harsh. Stephen?
Yeah, will we
wrap up?
We'll just do one old Bruadair one, because we mentioned his name. In 1985, he finally finished his translations of Dáibhí Ó Bruadair's poetry, the 17th century, born in Cork but associated with Limerick. There's a small biographical note, bilingual one from... So he was a great 17th century poet. His patrons were people like the Fitzgerald. He was one of the last poets trained in the bardic metres and part of the bardic tradition. He found himself being a poet of the aristocrats, being an aristocrat and nobleman himself, to being in difficult circumstances. Hartnett related particularly to the Dáibhí Ó Bruadair, who became washed up, a nobody, walking the roads, seeking work, a spalpeen, a bit like one Ruo Sulavoin. We could talk about his introduction is worth interesting, and his first association with Ó Bruadair was when he was 13 years old and was fascinated, spent years trying to figure out a way of translating him. Eventually went, and was criticised by some, because he was going quickly to... I kept his West Limerick audience before my mind and tried to convey how he would have come across in a literate but not scholarly public. He's trying to translate someone whose mindset is completely alien to a modern reader in many senses. He didn't even like ordinary Irish people. Ó Bruadair was in one sense an aristocrat, looked down on those that were around him, but ended up in difficult circumstances himself, a poet who had to become maybe impoverished after a while. Martin O'Murrough wasn't too happy about the translations, but he said Michael Hartnett himself sometimes slips into a rather broad translation. I cannot agree with the colloquial mode. He drew from his West Limerick English, that Hiberno English of West Limerick, to bring Hartnett into the English language, or Bruadair into the English language. This line is probably a bit insulting, and I think overstating it maybe, is appropriate but ultimately not ultimately successful. It's like the Bible in Scouse. I think that's too harsh. It aligns Ó Bruadair with a type of speech register which is at variance with the role he had in the society of his day. He was a member of the native learner class, yes, an aristocrat, yes, and his speech reflects that. This does not prevent him from being impolite, abusive, or earthy. Now we're going to look at one of those poems which was translated, and those of you that have the handout will see Thomas Kinsella, who was on the news tonight at his last public event, I see. He went to his school in Inchicore. He's retiring completely. He translated this poem by Ó Bruadair, and obviously in this famous collection on Dúnara, Poems of the Dispossessed, that collaboration between Sean O'Toole and Thomas Kinsella. Hartnett's, I'll just read quickly some of the original, and I'm not really qualified to read Ó Bruadair. I find him difficult to read. This is when he's basically been refused drink, something Hartnett was familiar with, for arriving in a state and looked impoverished and washed up and unacceptable. He was the great aristocratic poet. Now he couldn't get a drink. And like drawing from that great tradition of Irish curse poetry, where the filla had the power to inflict harm on you through poetry, he draws on it. For one of the most bitter satires or curses ever. Shervishach shergaha iagar shronach shask. Shervishach shergaha iagar shronach shask. Detig sheen is eber iata im scorn and fiacht. Berach shivrad etil gan loan tar lar and delavine gan deragli nar or my heart. Hartnett's translation, and then I'll just one more thing after that. A shriveled up skivvy, snappy, nosy, dry, refused when a craving for booze ate my insides. So this is the colloquial maybe, but it brings Ó Bruadair to life, I think. May she starve and a ghost overseas with her fly, that wizened old midget who wouldn't when Joram supplied. I'd teach her a lesson if I really did pay her back, and the decent house owners would give me on credit a cask. Though the beer was beside her, I just got a bitter attack. May the King of Glory not let her too long at her task. An overdone slut with no note in her throat, she flung and two-fingered me out of the door. As to where she came out of, I can say no more. Small harm if she popped a cat to a ghost. The imagery is striking, to say the least. She's no woman at all, that club-footed bitch with the driest old face you could meet on a trip. She talks apishly now, and she always will, and like a fool in her gruel may she dribble her shit. So that's Hartnett's translation. He's really trying to capture, you can see Kinsella's one, which is tamer, more restrained, and his English translation, which you can compare. The same similar thing happened to Hartnett in Dua, there, is it North Kerry or West Limerick, I'm forgetting. And he had a line, a simple words for those, and it appears in the Book of Strays. He travelled around to get in trouble at times, but this was a night where he was locked out of the pub in Dua. Abbey Fail is a fair old place, Kilmorna wouldn't grow a haw, Lyra Compan is the worst of all, but fuck me, Dua. The spirit of Ó Bruadair in the simplest terms there, maybe, I think. I think time might be against us. I don't know, John, if you have anything else to
well, I think that you couldn't beat a better line than
no, line to clear off on, didn't you?
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.